Good morning, good afternoon, social media friends, our connections. How are you today, Allison?
I am wonderful and so excited to chat with our next guest.
Yeah, I am. I'm excited as well, and as I mentioned to her and you, because I recently saw her on TV before the big game yesterday.
Hmm.
I thought, oh my gosh, our next celebrity that we get to hear from and learn more about. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce myself and Allison to you. If this is your first time listening and watching us, we are your hosts for today's episode of Leave It to the Experts. Yes, yes.
Woo.
So So now that we've shared with people who are watching us for the first time who we are, Allison, why don't you introduce your guests for today?
Yes. So, our next guest is someone I am extremely excited to talk to and hear more from. And just to give a little bit of a backstory, um, I came across this person came across my radar because we are actively entering an election period here in Chicago where we will be voting on our next alder person. And I live in the 26th ward, and the canvassers are out in full force. And so when this person's name came across my radar, I thought, let me do a little bit of research. And I love a story about someone who has overcome great odds despite many systemic roadblocks, despite the unlikeliness of, coming from a somewhat troubled or challenging background in a troubled or challenging area. And then when that person has an opportunity to give back to the community and to use their platform to do good in the community, I think our next guest is a fantastic example of that. And normally I would not, as a realtor, and I'm sure you can relate to this, Bill, as a lender. I mean, we're trying to appeal to a wide audience. We're not, trying to limit ourselves by, taking a stance on anything that's going to be too polarizing, at
Of
least in
course.
a professional sense. But to me, this is personal because I live in the 26th ward. Like I said, I have two school age children here. I've lived in Logan Square for 8 years and seen it go through tremendous changes, most of them great, some not so great. And so I'm very personally invested in the betterment of my own community. And so I want to hear from others who share my passion for my neighborhood. I'm very protective of Logan Square and a fierce defender of Logan and Humboldt and Avondale and all of these awesome West Side neighborhoods. So I think Jessie is going to really open our eyes to the things that we can all do at a grassroots level to help make our communities better, and why she believes she is the most qualified candidate for alderperson.
Yeah. So with that, um, as your why, you reached out to her. Let's bring Jesse into the studio. How about that?
Sounds good.
All right. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for
Hey.
having me.
Thank you for joining us. We know you're so busy. And I want to also let our audience know that we are recording this on February 13th, and early voting begins today. So, whatever your flavor, get out there and make sure you're registered to vote and vote, 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 vote. And this episode, we will make sure that this airs in time for the election so that everyone has an opportunity to hear you out, Jessie. But I just want to thank you for joining us today. And in the interest of everyone's time, to kind of jump in first and ask if you can share with us kind of so a Reader's Digest version of your background, your upbringing in Chicago, and what led you to the position that you're in today, running for alderperson.
Absolutely. So, I'm a Humboldt Park native, born and raised in this community. I grew up on Kedzie in between Beach and Hirsch. I am a daughter of this neighborhood and everything that it has to bring, right? Beautiful, hard, ugly. I grew up with, a parent that was incarcerated for most of my life. And, drug addiction being very real in our household. And, as a young person, I had to grow up relatively fast. And, the conditions in our communities force many young people across the 26th district to grow up quickly. And, as a young person, I didn't have the coping mechanisms that our young people deserve, right? The resources that they need to have healthy responses to some very difficult situations. My mom sent me to Carl Schurz High School because we lived in a community in which, the stigma is you do not send your child to Clemente High School because of all of the fears around gangs and drugs. And as a young person, I had a chip on my shoulder. It was really difficult to grow up in those conditions. And so, I got into, and I'm very transparent about my lived experience. I got into two physical altercations at the high school that I was at, ultimately leading to my expulsion. I'm a graduate of an alternative school, and I'm a proud graduate of an alternative school. And I tell folks all the time that it is my lived experience that has allowed me to fully understand what families across the 26th ward need. I know what it means to go to a woefully underfunded public school in the city of Chicago because I lived that. I know what it means not to have proper mental health services or case management services because I lived that. I know what it means to grow up in a house of drug addiction and having an incarcerated parent because I lived that. But I am also a living example that when we invest into our young people and provide them the services that they deserve, to have a community that can wrap around the young person and not discard them for the decisions that they have made, that they can end up on the other side, right? And, it was at a very young age. I was 17 years old. I ended up at Albizu Campos, a Puerto Rican high school, and I became politicized. I learned about, what the lack of investment can do to young people like me. And I immediately said from that point moving on, I wanted to ensure that I was an agent of change in my community and that young people wouldn't have to go through the things that I went through. Or that if they did, they would have the resources that they deserve to be on the right track. And so I became an educator. I was an educator for 10 years. I spent 6 of those beautiful years at Roberto Clemente Community Academy as a dean of students, and 4 of them at my alma mater, Albizu Campos. I'm a restorative justice practitioner. I believe in allowing young people to engage in a process of healing. More importantly, to be able to grapple with their generational trauma, but to also be able to gain the tools necessary to become agents of change in their own community. Most recently, I've done policy work around public safety, knowing that we have to grapple with some of the root causes of violence across our community to be able to build a healthy and thriving district for our families. And that means doing street intervention. That means opening mental health clinics. That means fully funding schools. And I am passionate that 26th Ward deserves an older person that's going to lead with love and care. And I believe I have the personal, political, and professional experience that that job requires.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, it's exactly what you shared about your background that resonated so strongly with me, because for those of us who did not grow up in this area and have only been here in, let's say, like the last 10 years or so, I think it looks very different than it did when I speak to my neighbors on my block here on the far west edge of Logan Square, bordering on Hermosa. And I speak to my neighbors who have been here long term. They tell a very different story. So what we see now is a lot more gentrification and changing demographics in the neighborhood. And my question for you with that is, being an older person when you get elected is going to provide you, we're manifesting,
That's right.
you have a lot of power and political clout as an older person in Chicago. Some might even say more than a mayor would have. But in this neighborhood, in this community, historically, there is a lot of mistrust of authority figures, politicians. People feel like they've been failed before. So how do you think that going from being active in the community as an organizer and as an educator and a restorative justice practitioner to being an elected official is going to affect or impact your ability to actually relate to your constituents and still, have that open line of communication. Hey, I'm one of you, rather than, oh, I see now, she joined the political machine.
Yeah. And that's a great question, because I tell people all the time, if you would have asked me last year at this time if I were to run for office, I would tell you, you're out of your mind, right? There's no way that I was going to be an elected official, because of everything that I know the organizing capacity can give you, right? But
Mm-hmm.
as an organizer and as an educator, there were so many walls that we were running into, in terms of how much we can push and how much we can organize and how much we can sustain community without having that legislative power that an aldermanic seat brings you, right? And we've been knocking on doors for the last 5 months, and I think that some of the most disheartening things that I hear is, I'm not going to vote. And I'm not going to
Mm-hmm.
vote because all of you are the same. You do the same thing. You make all these promises and you never show up. Or, you know, look at my community. It hasn't been invested in for over a decade. And we've seen that in the precincts that we just got in the most western part of the ward. We're talking about in Belmont, Cragen, and in most of our communities that have not received any type of investment, at least in a decade. And so when you walk into these communities, it's hard, right? To ask these families to once again trust what you are saying when they have been let down so many times. And what I tell people is, I am running for the aldermanic seat, not because this is a business transaction for me, not because I'm in it to line my own pockets, not because, I want to utilize the powers for my own privilege, but rather I am seeking to represent a district that quite literally saved my life.
Mm.
I am seeking to represent a district that I owe so much to. And we have to stop looking at electoral seats as places in which we can create deals and solidify them, but rather to utilize the seat to lead with love and care for a constituency base that needs our support. Look, I've lived on every single side of the park. I know what gentrification does, right? I have never lived on a side of the park where my lease didn't, increase by a couple $100s. We have families that are being displaced across the entire 26th ward because of new developments that have been brought in. What I tell people all the time is that there is so much power in the aldermanic seat to ensure that development does not mean displacement in the
Mm-hmm.
26th ward. And we have to have someone who, one, is going to ensure that we are sustaining families. And yes, that means bringing in more affordable housing units. Yes, that means bringing in affordable home ownership opportunities. But we also have to start thinking about, what are we doing across governmental sectors? Because the 26th ward also needs someone who can work with state legislators, county legislators, so that we can begin developing and drafting legislation that's going to make an impact long term for our residents. Because it's not enough to say that we're going to make sure that we stop multi-million-dollar developments, because we are not immortal, right? We're not in these seats forever. What we do in 4 years can be undone by the next candidate. What we
Mm-hmm.
can do is put laws in place that outlive us. And in order to do that, we need folks who know how to legislate, who understand policy, and who understand the importance of doing the work long term, because it's not about me, right? Because to create short term solutions is to ensure that you will still vote for me so that I can keep my seat. But I am in
Mm-hmm.
this to create long term solutions that outlive me, so that we can sustain families in the city of Chicago, particularly on the Northwest side, where we are seeing gentrification in full force, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. With all the pros and cons that come with it. I do want to circle back to you making mention of creating more affordable housing. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you, and I really ask this in earnest because I'm sure Bill would agree and co-sign on this. I think it's important to both of us to also be actively out there in our communities, not just because we want to grow our sphere of influence, but because, like you're saying, you want to create long-term change for the good. And so I'm always looking for volunteer opportunities and ways that I can contribute my time. But sometimes the problems feel like they're so big and so hard to wrap
Yeah.
your arms around. And when you don't get that instant gratification that is like the currency in our world right now, it feels sort of hopeless. And
Yeah.
from your standpoint, what advice would you give to someone like myself or Bill, who is just, a lay person who cares about their community and wants to do more and be involved, but doesn't have the capacity to run for office? We don't have political connections. We just want to help make some incremental positive changes.
Absolutely. No, I truly appreciate that question. And I think first and foremost, you are already doing it, right? This platform can be utilized to continue to tell the counter narrative. I think that, often um, people join movements or they join, an organization, and because there's not that instant gratification, hope is often lost, right? In moments like this. And I tell people all the time, who are movers and shakers, who are organizers and activists, that when you come into this work, we have to understand that we are in a struggle in perpetuity, meaning it is long term, right? And often what we are fighting for, we may not achieve in our lifetime. And so, I think that for us, the best that we can do is to engage in a process in which we are continuing to build consciousness across our community. Education is the best tool that we can provide our neighbors, right? In addition to occasionally volunteering with an organization, or doing some work in the community, participating in big events, the long-term work is, what are we doing to ensure that we are building consciousness in our community, because that spreads beyond
Mhm.
us, right? It inspires beyond us. I tell people all the time, I can remember the moment I became an activist. I was sitting in a classroom, I was 17 years old. It was 3 days before I was going on winter break, and I heard the word colonialism, and I couldn't turn back after that. There was nothing that was going to stop me from what I wanted to do as an activist, because something in me had just turned on fully, and it changed who I was. And that is what we have to start doing. We have to start creating spaces in which we are inspiring people, but more importantly, getting them to understand the social context in which they live in, right?
Mhm.
Often we have so many community members across our city who just don't understand, like, why do I continuously get displaced from my home? Why am I running into so many barriers? Why are there so many people in our community that are homeless? And we live in a city that has funds out. Like, there's so many questions that our residents just don't have the answers to, but we can provide them. And that is the work.
Yeah, it's such a great explanation, the way you lay that out. And I really like how you said a couple of times that you're here to lead with love and care, because when you listen closely to people's stories, you hear a lot of hurt and a lot of pain and a lot of disenfranchisement, and something, frankly, I really took for granted before becoming more involved in my own community and getting to know more of my neighbors on a closer level, on a deeper level, and understanding that a lot of people have stories that are very similar to yours, and some have found pathways out of that cycle of generational trauma, and there are a lot of people who are really still struggling. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you bringing the compassion and the empathy to the table, because we definitely need more of that these days. Um, Now we have to get a little more granular. And I think I'm going to toss that to Bill to take it down a level deeper and to get into more of the specifics about some of your initiatives and how those specific initiatives will impact our community.
Absolutely.
So, Bill, would you like to lead off the next question?
I would love to. Thank you for sharing, Jessie, so transparently, but more important, so clearly, your personal why.
Hmm.
Um, and as Allison mentioned already, for both her business and my business, one of the challenges we face when we hear from our clients, um, past clients, is that of um, affordable housing, and that can mean something different to every demographics,
Yeah.
right? I know that one of your initiatives is implementing a property tax freeze. So my question to you is, based on what you know right now, looking ahead, what are the obstacles that exist for you to try to implement this?
Yeah. Absolutely. So, we utilize the property tax revenue to really fill the gap across the city of Chicago. And when we do things like assessments, we increase those property taxes based on those assessments so that we can continue to produce revenue for things like pension, for things like that. What
Yeah.
we have to start thinking about is what are other creative ways in which we can produce revenue in the city of Chicago. And there was an ordinance called the Bring Home Chicago Ordinance that laid out, a real tax transfer that would allow us to produce revenue in just a different way. And so when I talk about having this tax freeze, right, a lot of people are like, there's no way that's going to happen. But what I tell people is, look, we have to be able to really think about how are we utilizing our political capital to ensure that we are working with legislators across different governmental sectors. And one of my visions is to be able to create a tax freeze for long-term residents that have been here 15 years or more, right?
Okay.
And we could do that at the state level. It's extremely possible to pass a piece of legislation that does that for residents. It's not to say that those residents are not going to pay property taxes. It's just to say where their property taxes were in that 15-year mark will not increase moving forward. Because again, the development in our communities should not mean the displacements of families that have been there for so long. And so, it is going to take a lot of work. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, nor will it happen overnight. In fact, it may not happen when we are elected in the first term, but I am committed to working from day one until we can achieve that.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Um, for property owners, whether they live in the property in the 26th ward, and or property owners who are landlords and investors, one of the drivers as to um, housing becoming less affordable is property taxes. When they get out of hand, one of two things happen. I can't afford it anymore if you are an owner occupant of the property, or if you're the landlord investor, well, guess what happens?
Right.
You have to look at your tenant and say, I got to jack up rent.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Right. Right.
So, yeah, thank you also for being, I guess, real and transparent with flat out saying that it may not occur, or you may not get enough momentum for it to kind of hit and be real as soon as you want it to.
Right.
Um, my next question is, I know rent control is part of this big picture.
Yep.
And you and I both know those two words, rent control, it's so controversial.
Yeah.
Why? Because here in the 50 states of the US, there's only like a handful of states that have embraced it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you believe you can do to get landlords to embrace it more?
Yeah. Well, I believe it is the commitment that we are not going to forget about property owners, right? I think that often when we talk about rent control, property owners feel like we are only considering the renter and not the financial burden that they have had to experience due to the property tax increases. Because, Bill, to your point, right, most landlords have to raise rent in order just to keep up with the bills that come in with their property tax installment invoices. And so it's not because they want to make a big profit oftentimes, and it's not because they want to displace these residents, but rather it's because they're also trying to sustain themselves. And
True.
so that is why I do not introduce or advocate for a rent control policy apart from the property tax incentive, right? Because we know that those things are hand in hand. The only way we're going to achieve rent control in the state of Illinois is if we are also working as hard to protect our property owners. And I am keenly aware of how much our property owners are just struggling to survive. I mean, some of the landlords in our community in the 26th ward, those who own commercial properties, 3 units or more,
Right.
have seen a property tax increase of $5,000 or more in this last installment. That is the formula for displacement.
Right.
And so the only way they can sustain themselves and the upkeep of what a commercial building like that requires is to increase the income. And so I'm fully aware that we have to be able to tackle both issues at the same time. But nonetheless, I am an advocate of rent control. Yeah.
Okay. And as we wrap up, one last question, Jessie. What is one idea that you can share with our audience today, your audience, as to your idea of increasing affordable home ownership?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are currently about 30 city-owned lots across the 26th ward. Lots that my dream is to create affordable home ownership opportunities on them. So we're going to build affordable single-family homes that we sell well below market value, but that we also have in a trust,
Mm,
because having the homes in a trust will protect our homeowners from those massive property tax increases, right? But more importantly, it ensures that developers who come into communities to try to flip homes to make a profit cannot do that because those homes are in a trust. And so what I want to do is to be able to build these single family homes, get them to sell from anywhere from 250 to 325,000. Um, and you can't buy it and then sell it at double the price, right?
right.
And that's the point of keeping it safe in a trust, because I think it is extremely important to also consider that our low income and middle class families too want to be a part of creating generational wealth, and we know there are two ways to do that in our community: own a home or start a business.
Right.
And so, in order to begin really thinking about what strategic ways are we going to help our families build generational wealth, is to at least allow them to be able to afford a home in a community that they've lived in their entire lives. Because it's not enough, right, to just bring in affordable home owner, affordable homes that are rental units without creating opportunities for those affordable rental units to allow families to save to purchase in our community, right? So we have to be able to have a comprehensive plan that really considers housing, one of our most critical issues in the 26th ward, and that means creating affordable home ownership opportunities, bringing in more affordable rental units, but also ensuring that housing is a right in the city of Chicago, and that means we must house our homeless. And so all of those pillars in housing are a part of my legislative plan.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you for answering um, the second half of the questions that were on my mind. So, Allison, right back at you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad to hear you talk about affordable home ownership, because approaching it with the very, in my opinion, narrow view of this like Band-Aid solution of creating more low income rentals it does not align with what you stated earlier, which is that, you're here to make long-term change. It doesn't allow people to really put down roots in a community and feel like they have that personal stake in actually seeing the entire community do better. And statistically, we know that the net worth of homeowners is roughly 330% that of a renter. We know that renters are more likely than homeowners to be behind on their bills. It really kind of makes you feel like a hamster in a wheel, and with no ability to actually get ahead, to break those generational chains of trauma, and to create the generational wealth that's going to ultimately, we hope, spill back into our community in the form of better funded schools, in the form of more businesses, more after school programs for kids. All the things that I think we all want to see. It's just a matter of finding the person and the team that's got the best solution, the best roadmap to get us there. So I really appreciate everything you've shared for us. And, You've been so transparent and spelled it out so clearly. And these are all such important subjects. And Bill and I field questions about these things all the time. If somebody's getting serious about purchasing a home in a particular community, what are they going to ask about? They're going to ask about the taxes. They're going to ask about the schools. They're going to ask about crime. And then they're going to ask about proximity to, whatever amenities that community offers in the form of restaurants or retail or parks or whatever that may be. So all those building blocks and puzzle pieces really come together and are extremely important to what Bill and I do for a living, and extremely important for our audience who's listening and watching and making the important decision of where they are going to plant a flag for themselves and their family. So I hope that when people watch this episode, that more people will consider planting that flag in the 26th ward, because it is a fantastic community with people who really genuinely care about making it better, like yourself. So just thank you so much for making the time to do this with us today.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. And again, it is platforms like this that are making the difference and raising awareness and consciousness. And so I appreciate you both for having me here today.
You're very welcome,
Absolutely.
Jessie. And everyone, as we now wrap up, you heard it from Jessie. The outcome that we all want can be achieved if individually we come together and contribute to the cause. So what's in front of Jessie right now, what's in front of the residents of the 26th ward, including Allison, is your contribution is your voice. And so in the near term, go out there, make your voice heard. So once again, ladies, thank you for sharing your time with me. I certainly learned a whole lot more about you, Jessie, beyond what I can see through the little media bites. And Allison, thank you for asking her to share her time with us today.
I was very excited to do it. So this was great.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
You too.
Thanks so
Thank you
much,
so
Bill.
much.
Thanks again, Jessie. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.